So I think from an FDI perspective, I mean, to putting a number to that would be very difficult. I mean, it's like shooting into the sunlight, right? So I think the important thing to look at there is I think what will happen on the African continent is that economies that are more diversified will be more resilient to the process. I do agree with David that we will see a significant decline in growth rates that will be impacted by both COVID-19 and obviously the price wars going on. Other thing that is important for me to highlight is, so yes, we do know that tourism will be significantly impacted. That's the one sector we know will be significantly impacted. Countries like Morocco will feel the pain of that, with them growing that as part of their total GDP. In terms of the impact of the coronavirus, I think it is important to note that Ebola is a much more heavier virus to carry and would not spread as easily as COVID-19. The challenge for Africa remains the public healthcare system, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa. I think Morocco and I think Tunisia has made some good strides in terms of the development of their healthcare. So I think North Africa will feel the impact a bit less than sub-Saharan Africa. The challenge for sub-Saharan Africa remains highly populated and dense areas with little awareness of the impact of the virus and how to contain that. So I think it's really unknown in terms of how the virus plays out. And the way I see it right now is that COVID-19 in Africa is not real right now because we haven't really seen its impact and its ability to spread right now. And only once it becomes a larger issue, if it does become a big issue, will essentially drive out how investment comes into Africa. And I think the second point, going back to the US and some of the larger economies, I think they've become very much internally focused. So they will be having to allocate resources in terms of how they manage this war within their own jurisdictions first before they look at foreign investment. So I think that's going to be it's a different ball game we're looking at right now, and we have to look into the different lens. I think that's where I do agree with David.
So let's stay then with that more political lens. Vincent, you sort of looking at West Africa very closely. There are elections coming up in Côte d'Ivoire in October, in Ghana in November. There are no elections in Nigeria till 2023, but it is an eminently political time in the country with people fighting over the glittering electoral prize of Kano as we speak. The emir was dethroned a couple of days ago. What do you think political impacts of a severe coronavirus outbreak might be?
So I think again we can go back to the first effect and secondary effects. Looking at first effect, there's a question that was raised just a moment ago on the capacity of those countries to handle an outbreak and the strain that puts on governments, potentially the way that completely can shatter the popularity of a government if it is seen to be either lying about the numbers or being completely unable to respond. So it is the kind of event that potentially could play into the hands of opposition candidates in elections. However, we recognize that in many of those elections coming up, there is still a huge premium on being the incumbent or being part of the ruling camp, and controlling many of the other factors that really make the decision in those elections. Perhaps the one that we will be watching the most closely will be Ghana, heading towards general elections at the end of November, early December. Ghanaian elections are traditionally very competitive. There is a two-party system that regularly produces changes of power. And Nana Akufo-Addo, the president since 2016, was already facing quite a tight re-election campaign. On record, his economic record is solid. When you look at growth rates, when you look at the way he has managed to stabilize the economy, voters don't necessarily see it the same way because of a lot of these early election promises have not necessarily materialized, but also some of the headline growth or inflation indicators are not felt in the same way by the population. So Akufo-Addo was already facing quite a tough race for election. Now the oil price crashing means Ghana will have slightly less money to spend, and therefore slightly less money this year to spend on populist, or you could argue fairly targeted pre-election spending to win votes. And it is potentially, if you know the virus would spread to Ghana, and I should state that at this stage there are no recorded cases there. This is perhaps where, of all countries, we could see you know, the virus potentially having a political impact on the results of the election. It is far too early to say that with certainty. I'm just flagging Ghana as I think one of the main countries to follow for political impacts. More generally, perhaps stepping out of elections, the types of impacts that we could see at a societal level is first a rise in fake news, and the challenges actually for a lot of businesses in those areas, organization in those areas, in dealing with news that might spread like wildfire around the virus, often without any substance to them. And it is something that we see around any election time, but in a high publicity topic such as coronavirus, we've already seen an uptick in cases of complete misreporting or fake news around that. The other repercussion that we saw so far, mainly isolated incidents, have to do with hostility towards Chinese nationals. And we did see in a few countries cases of either harassment or hostility or just rumors again spreading concerning Chinese nationals in cities. Perhaps the significance of this will now wane a little bit now that the epidemic is spreading, and that most of the cases actually come from European countries rather than China. But these are the main political consequences that we're seeing right away. There's also obviously the broader question around trust in healthcare system, and whether, as the other panelists pointed, you know, the lack of trust and the lack of belief in state capacity for healthcare will have an impact on how the virus spreads.
David, maybe you could give us a historical perspective. Is there anything we can learn from previous pandemics, or is this such a novel virus and the interconnection of the world so deep that it's hard to sort of read back from history any potential future?
Well, let's just try and work out what we can learn. This virus, if it isn't, would be exactly having the hallmarks of a biogenetic weapon. And there are many labs in the world that would have created substances that behave like this in the way it transmits. What makes it different is the incubation period, the infectivity period, and the viral load over a period of time that it's unstoppable with our normal systems. If you look at the influenza and the Spanish flu, which was of 50 million people, and it went through 3 waves in effect through society, and those waves are relevant actually, because I think we will see waves in terms of infection and get it under control and come back again. But the issue here is this RNA virus has an incredible ability to mutate. We've already seen 2 strains of mutation. And the concerning thing is the bigger the pool in which this infects, the more likely you are to have numerical permutations. Now, some of those can be have lower mortality rates, and some of them can have increased mortality rates. So the more the virus gets into the human pool before we have an immunity, the greater the risk it develops something that's even more unpleasant. So I think the interconnectivity of the world is a concern when you multiply that times the size of the pool and the probabilities of new strains. That's completely new. And yes, we have a vaccine capability, but it's not for 12 to 18 months in any scale required. So we're completely exposed prior to that moment. And in many ways, I think we're just as vulnerable as they were in 1918 through the 2 years where they saw the Spanish flu in 3 waves. And so the lessons are, it can be highly damaging to society, even though we have modern technology. The concern I have over Africa when I hear that there are not many cases is quite simple. There's very little testing. And I don't believe the numbers in the UK. I don't believe our governments have been honest with us in the Western world about the qualities we're seeing. And we're about to find out the gaps between what they told us and what we're really about to experience. But one of the things that's interesting is America has a terrible testing problem. Its kits don't work. They don't have enough of them. So you don't really know how it's spreading, and you don't know whether you're containing it or not. Africa's problem is completely compounded. There is no way that it's going to do enough testing to create accurate containment around the clusters before they join up. So I just think we have to assume it's everywhere. We have to assume it's transmitting at a fairly similar rate. And suddenly when you start to see like any more than 50 cases with a corresponding death, you know that your curve is going to look like every other country before you. So those are the key lessons. Actually look at China, look at Italy, look at Southern Korea, look what they went through, and look at the variations in their flows, what they did and how they did it, and learn from each country who's ahead of you in the chain.
The immunologists that my sister, who is a doctor, and I have to, obviously, this is not medical advice, but just to echo some of those concerns, the immunologists' great fear, I believe, is what happens when it comes back in October. That's when we might see something you mentioned, David. That's when we might see the mutation, and if it does, it will come at a highly charged time for the world. And it was touched on earlier. If it comes back in October, with a more lethal form, just ahead of the U.S. elections, it will certainly provoke some serious ructions. Arshad, we probably won't see the V-shaped economic recovery that was being talked about glibly 6 weeks ago. It might well be more U-shaped. What does it mean for Africa when the US economy goes into a prolonged slump?
I think it will have a significant impact on Africa overall. I do think that Africa is, especially South Africa, interlinked with the international markets. So we will see a significant impact in Africa's largest economies, and essentially will push the continent backwards in terms of the prescribed growth rates of 5% in East Africa, 5.5% in North Africa. We'll see that coming down quite significantly, and we'll see a huge drag on African economies until we see global pickup, specifically related to the US and China.
And Vincent, talking about the long-term impacts that the coronavirus outbreak might have on African economies, there is a concern, I guess, that every single region of the world will be busy trying to rebuild. If, God forbid, there is an Italian banking crisis, then you can be sure that the Eurozone will be extremely focused on that. China, which had traditionally been a source of largesse, was already tightening the taps even before this hit. I mean, we saw in Kenya, they did not agree to fund the next leg of the single gauge railway. But that's just one example. There are others. What do you expect the long-term impact to be? And if those traditional sources of relief are absent, how will African economies cope?
So you're right. I think perhaps the impact coming from China is the most significant. There was already perhaps a more measured approach coming from China towards lending and towards financing infrastructure projects on the continent. I think that was visible starting from 2018 when they made clear that from now on the projects that they were financing should be more economically viable, backed by pre-feasibility studies, and also to address the concern that were raised around environment, for example, that they should be more there should be environmental safeguards as part of them. So that had already driven a bit more caution on the part of Chinese lenders towards projects in Africa. I think now the truth is that they are going to be busy with the recovery at home, and so you can expect that the focus is certainly not going to be on infrastructure lending for faraway places, however important that is to China's foreign policy objectives. So I think there will be a slight contraction in the amount of lending, in the amount of funding that some of these countries can seek to finance large bulk infrastructure coming, talking about roads, railway, hydropower dams, the kinds of projects where Chinese companies have typically played a big role